Welcome back. President Trump met today with Venezuelan opposition leader María Corina Machado at the White House. Even as his administration moves forward with working with Venezuela's interim leader and Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, we are expecting Machado to speak on Capitol Hill after her meeting with a bipartisan group of lawmakers. You see her there. We're waiting to hear what she has to say about her meeting with President Trump, and we will bring that to you as soon as we get it. Now, those meetings come a day after President Trump spoke with Delcy Rodriguez, praising her and calling her a, quote, terrific person. But the future of Venezuela remains uncertain. As part of the administration's ongoing pressure campaign, the Department of Defense announced today it seized yet another sanctioned oil tanker that was operating near Venezuela, making it the sixth known tanker seized by the United States. Meanwhile, Republicans in Congress appear to be backing down from their efforts to try to rein in the president's authorities. Yesterday, Vice President J.D. Vance casting a tie-breaking vote, blocking a resolution that would have prevented the president from using military force in Venezuela without congressional approval. Senators Josh Hawley and Todd Young, who both voted to advance the measure, flipping, voting against it after coming under immense pressure from the White House. Joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba. Monica, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it. So what exactly are you hearing and learning about President Trump's meeting with opposition leader María Corina Machado today?
Well, we know, Kristen, that it did last over an hour. The two were set to have lunch together at the White House, but it was behind closed doors. This was not a meeting where the president decided to open it up to the press or to the cameras, so it's unclear exactly what they discussed, and hopefully we will get more of a sense from María Corina Machado herself. But this is a remarkable moment, Kristen, because just a few weeks ago, before Nicolás Maduro was captured, she was essentially very careful, right, about where she could be and where she was publicly seen. She undertook a perilous journey just to be able to accept her Nobel Peace Prize in person. And so the fact that she's here in Washington now having all of these meetings, there is this open conversation about what her future is going to look like and whether it's going to be as a potential leader of Venezuela. But according to the White House, they didn't want to get into that or whether the president even discussed her Nobel Peace Prize, though it's hard to imagine, given how much he has talked about wanting that didn't come up in their conversation today. Kristen.
Well, and it's notable, Monica, because allies of María Corina Machado are hoping that meeting helped the president to view the interim leadership differently in Venezuela. Of course, the interim leader is an ally of Nicolás Maduro. Is there any sense that today's meeting moved the mark in that regard?
It's hard to say, and look, the president spoke very recently with Delcy Rodriguez, with the interim leader, and according to the White House, had a very good conversation with her, and according to them and according to the president, she is cooperating, which was an important criteria for him in terms of making decisions about what could happen next in Venezuela. So for now, it's unclear how that moves the needle. And remember that, according to the White House, there was basically an intel assessment leading up to the days and decision about ousting Nicolás Maduro in terms of who the U.S. should back, who basically should get that endorsement from the president. And according to U.S. intel assessments, again, that person was Delcy Rodriguez, who is, as you point out, a very close ally of Maduro. And throughout the people that she's working with, those top officials, really, it is still the Maduro regime, just without Nicolás Maduro. Kristen.
And Monica, finally, what can you tell us about this sixth oil tanker that was seized?
Yeah, that's right. And this is something that senior White House officials tell me you're going to likely continue to see happen. This is something where the U.S. says that this vessel, known as the Veronica, was carrying sanctioned oil. And so you did have another operation with the U.S. Coast Guard. And you're seeing video there of how exactly those forces landed onto the vessel and were able to seize it. Again, that is the sixth one, as you point out. And we are told that this will continue to happen. But it does come on the heels of the news that the first transaction, we understand, of oil from Venezuela has been completed, and that amount was for $500 million. Remember, this is what the president announced about somewhere between 30 and 50 million barrels of oil that the U.S. is going to sell and then control, and that is just the first, according to the White House, of many deals that they say they expect to announce. Kristen.
Monica Alba, thank you so much, as always, from the White House. Really appreciate it. And joining me now is Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida. Congresswoman Schultz, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. So let's talk about this meeting that President Trump had with Venezuela's opposition leader, María Corina Machado, today. What do you make of the meeting? What are your key takeaways at this point?
Well, Kristen, it appears that this meeting was nothing more than a box-checking exercise for President Trump, that was evident that he gave her a courtesy meeting. From the reports that I'm hearing out of the meeting, there was nothing of substance. He appears to be throwing in his lot with Delcy Rodriguez, who he, as you noted, called her a terrific person. My Venezuelan constituents in my district strongly disagree. She is essentially Maduro's puppet, was his right hand. This is basically, swapping the head of one snake for another. And, notably, there's been really very little in the way of release of political prisoners, even though they said they were going to be producing a big number. I mean, what we need is a transition to democracy, the release of political prisoners, and we need to make sure that Venezuelans here in the United States, who Trump revoked TPS from, have certainty and are able to remain in this country while there is so much danger and instability in Venezuela.
I had the opportunity to talk to one of your colleagues, Congresswoman Salazar, yesterday. I want to play you a little bit of what she had to say and get your reaction on the other side. Take a look. If there is more military action in Venezuela, significant military action, do you think the president would need to get authorization? I know you were opposed to it when it came through the House.
Yeah, but we know that there will be no need for any more military action.
You're that confident?
Because, of course, because Delcy and Padrino and Diosdado and all these people who stole the country for 25 years, I have info that they know that there is a new sheriff, and they're not going to be playing with the White House, because look what happened to Maduro.
Do you agree with her assessment? She says they're not going to be playing with the White House. They know there's a new sheriff in town.
The new sheriff is the same as the old sheriff. It's just got, it's just a woman instead of a man. What is she talking about? I mean, I know she really has confidence in President Trump, but all I've seen Trump do so far, and my constituents have expressed concern that there's been no commitment to transition to democracy, to ensure, I mean, he hasn't even mentioned Edmundo Gonzalez, the rightful president of Venezuela, meeting with María Corina today. I'm glad that happened, but I mean, there needs to be a process established. It should have been a process that was established with all the excruciating planning that they did to remove Maduro, which was an action I supported. But we need to make sure that, as María Corina came out of the White House and said, that Trump, they are counting on Trump. The Venezuelan people are counting on Trump, because he says he's in charge, to help deliver Venezuela to freedom. And keeping the same regime leadership in place, who are engaged in repression as we speak, is not the outcome that should result from this action.
I wonder what you make of the timeline that the president has laid out. I had the opportunity to talk to him. I said, can elections be held within 30 days? He said, absolutely not. He said, that's just not realistic. And then in a later interview with the New York Times, said that the United States could be there for years to come. What do you make of that timeline?
That's an outrageous timeline. What's evident is that the president cared the most about being able to control Venezuela's oil. Lining the pockets of his billionaire cronies is what the president seems to always default to. I know I'm concerned, and my Venezuelan constituents are concerned about making sure that their family members are able to live in freedom and peace and prosperity. That doesn't seem to be where Donald Trump is headed. If he were, he would have established a process and announced a process to transition to democracy. Instead, you have the same cronies, the same regime there, who, Kristen, have actually cracked down on expression. They're searching cars, they're searching cell phones to see whether people have supported or promoted the capture of Maduro. They passed a decree to allow that. My Venezuelan constituents are telling me that most Venezuelans are staying, especially in the Caracas area, are staying in their homes because they're still deathly afraid. We need to make sure that this process releases political prisoners, all of them, that it establishes a democratic transition, whether it's free elections or one that is presided over by Maria Corina and her opposition party. And we need to ensure that Venezuelans here in the United States remain safe and are not deported back to a regime that the State Department currently is advising Americans not to travel to. How does that make sense?
Well, Congresswoman, what do you mean? I mean, they did release some political prisoners. Do you give the president credit for that having happened? And I understand you're saying all of the political prisoners need to be released.
I mean, I'm glad that 5 Americans were released, but I mean, the National Assembly president, who is Delcy Rodriguez's brother, he promoted that they were going to be releasing a big number. I'm hearing that it was less than 25. That they released. I mean, there's 800 plus political prisoners there at least. What are they waiting for? Why is the president not using his leverage? He has so much leverage and control over Delcy Rodriguez. Then why are all the political prisoners not released yet? What reason is there for them to continue to be captive? Why haven't we had a process established or even a discussion about a process that we have to transition to a sovereign nation of Venezuela being able to manage their own affairs? That should not take years. I agree, probably 30 days is too quick, but we need a reasonable timeline so that we are not there interminably.
Let me ask you about another foreign conflict that the world is watching, Iran. We've seen the protesters, the violent crackdown there. President Trump had posted help is on the way. It seems as though, at least for now, and who knows what will happen in hours from now, there has been no action by the United States. Would you support regime change in that country or some type of U.S. military action?
Well, I certainly want to make sure, I would like to see the Iranian people be able to live in freedom and free from the horrific oppression that exists there. But there are ways of doing that short of military action. President Trump is really concerned. Their Arab neighbors. There are Arab neighbors to Iran that are deeply concerned about the potential for military action. We need to make sure we use sanctions pressure, that we rally economic pressure around Iran. We can tighten the noose, certainly. We have many other steps we can take before some kind of military action would be necessary. But unless there's a direct threat to the United States that I am not yet aware of, I would want to see hear a briefing from the White House to know why military action was necessary, and Congress should certainly be consulted before anything like that happens.
Okay. Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, thank you so very much for joining us. Thanks for your perspective. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kristen.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.